Hello, welcome to the channel. Today I'm going to share with you an incredible and transformative story full of emotions and twists that will touch everyone's hearts. Before we start, let us know in the comments which city you're watching. I love knowing where our stories are going. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss any content like this. Ready? So let's go on this journey together. My name is Levi Solomon, and my past is like a tapestry woven with the traditions and values of Orthodox Judaism. I was born in Williamsburg, New York, into a devoted family deeply rooted in faith. My father, Moshe Solomon, was a Torah scholar, known for his phenomenal memory and his ability to quote entire passages accurately. My mother, Esther, devoted every minute of her days to prayer, keeping a kosher home, and raising her children to the highest standards of spiritual purity. Since I was little, my destiny seemed set. I demonstrated an unusual talent for religious studies. While other children were memorizing small portions of the Torah, I was reciting entire books, absorbing the teachings with an insatiable hunger. My father used to call me Torah, son of the Torah, a title that filled his voice with pride. At age 12, I was sent to one of the strictest yeshivas in New York. There, my days began before dawn, with morning prayers, and ended late at night, after long hours of study. There was no room for worldly distractions. Every moment was dedicated to understanding the Word of God and applying its laws. My rise in the community was rapid. At 18, he was already considered a prodigy. My rabbi mentor, Isaac Cohen, often told others, "Levi is not just a student, he is a teacher in training." With his guidance, I began teaching small classes to other students, explaining the more complex details of halakha and rabbinic interpretations. Over time, I took on greater responsibilities. At age 25, I was named rabbi of one of Williamsburg's most respected synagogues. It was a role I played with zeal. In the eyes of my community, I was a pillar of wisdom and leadership. My sermons drew crowds, and my counseling sessions were sought after by those seeking spiritual guidance. However, inside me, something was changing. There were specific passages from the Torah and the prophets that made me uneasy. Isaiah 53, for example, spoke about the suffering servant, a figure that seemed far beyond any traditional interpretation I knew. In my heart, a question arose that I dared not share. Who, in fact, was this servant? One night, after a long day of study and prayer, I mentioned the passage from Isaiah to Rachel, my wife. "It's a metaphor," she replied without hesitation. "The rabbis have already explained this." "I know," I replied, hesitantly. "But what if there's more? What if we're missing something?" Rachel frowned. "Levi, you're tired. You better rest." His eyes reflected concern, but also a line I shouldn't cross. For her, for my congregation, for my entire family, doubting traditional interpretations was unthinkable. And so, I suppressed these doubts. I continued preaching, teaching, and counseling, convincing myself that my mind was being tested and that my faith must prevail. Still, deep within my soul, an uneasiness persisted. I felt like a man looking at a closed door, knowing there is something precious on the other side, but not having the courage to turn the handle. It was an ordinary night in our Williamsburg home. Rachel was in the kitchen, organizing the dishes for the dinner we had just shared. Our routine conversations flowed, between discussions about preparations for the next Shabbat and small comments about the class I had taught that morning. It was a moment of peace, the serenity of a predictable and regulated life, surrounded by the traditions that sustained us. As Rachel cleaned the table, I noticed that the toaster had broken. It had been having problems over the last few days, but that night it seemed to stop working altogether. I wasn't exactly a handyman with repairs, but I liked to take care of small household issues on my own. I picked up the toaster and said, almost as a joke, "Let me show you that, in addition to being a rabbi, I can be an amateur mechanic." "Levi, be careful," Rachel warned, with a brief smile. "Maybe it's best to leave that for tomorrow." "It's a simple thing," I replied. "It'll take 5 minutes." I opened the toaster on the counter, examining the internal components. It seemed like an easy task. I grabbed a screwdriver and started messing with the wires. What I didn't realize was that, during dinner, some water had splashed onto the device. Everything was wet, and I didn't think to completely unplug the toaster from the socket. That's when it happened. The moment I touched one of the internal wires, an electrical wave coursed through my body with indescribable force. It wasn't just pain. It was as if my entire body was being ripped apart by an invisible, paralyzing force. I tried to scream, but my voice wouldn't come out. Everything around me seemed to freeze. The electrical shock threw me backwards, and my head hit the cold tile of the kitchen floor. For a moment, I heard Rachel scream my name, but her voice quickly became a distant echo. My field of vision began to darken. The pain disappeared, giving way to a strange feeling of emptiness, and then everything went out. There was no more sound, light, or pain. Just absolute, oppressive silence, as if I had been ripped from reality and placed in an endless void. It was an absence of everything I knew, as if my very being was disintegrating. Meanwhile, in reality, Rachel was running to the phone, desperate. "Someone, please, my husband is unconscious. He's not breathing." The paramedics arrived quickly, bursting into our kitchen amidst the confusion. One of them, a man named Mark, began performing chest compressions, while another prepared the defibrillator. Rachel watched the scene in tears, her hands covering her mouth to contain a scream that she could no longer hold back. "Cardiac arrest time," Mark asked his colleague. 3 minutes, came the reply. "We won't give up. One more load." Meanwhile, I was no longer there. My body was lying in the kitchen of my house, but my soul, it had been transported to another place. When everything around me went dark, I realized I had crossed a line. I could no longer feel my body, the cold kitchen floor, or the sound of voices around me. I was in a completely different place, but place might not be the right word. It was such an absolute void that I couldn't distinguish where I ended and where nothingness began. I was in total darkness. It wasn't like closing your eyes, where you still perceive shadows or your own consciousness. This darkness was dense, almost tangible, as if it had weight. Every part of me felt like it was being swallowed by it, but paradoxically, I still existed there, conscious. The silence was deafening. There were no familiar sounds, just an emptiness that crushed my soul. But gradually, I started to hear something. At first, it was like a whisper, so low it almost sounded like my imagination. But the whispers grew, turning into voices. These voices were unlike anything I had ever heard. They did not come from outside, but from within the void itself. They were wailing voices, full of regret and despair. Some spoke in Hebrew, others in languages I didn't recognize. But what shook me deeply was the content of the words. "They were right," a voice whispered, with almost palpable pain. "I rejected what was clear. Now it's too late," another lamented. I heard fragments of known prayers, but they were recited differently. The words that once carried hope and connection to God were now filled with grief and desolation. They were not prayers of faith, but of desperate souls, crying out for something they felt was lost forever. I began to feel a growing oppression around me. It wasn't just the darkness. It was as if that darkness was alive, conscious, and watching me. It wrapped around me like a cloak, but offered no comfort. Instead, it felt exposed, as if everything I was being put on display. Who am I here? I thought, trying to understand. Why am I listening to this? Why am I here? The moment this question crossed my mind, I realized something that chilled my soul. Those voices, I wasn't just a listener. They were around me, but also inside me, as if, on some level, his confessions were reflections of doubts and truths that I had repressed throughout my life. "I knew," a voice inside me whispered, distinct from the others. It was mine. I knew there was more, but I rejected. I felt tears flow, even though I wasn't sure if I still had a body. I began to realize that this darkness wasn't just a place of emptiness. It was a place of revelation, where the truth, which I so feared facing, was impossible to ignore. But at the same time, I started to notice something else. There was something beyond the darkness. It wasn't visible yet, but I could feel it. Something was moving, getting closer. I didn't know what it was, but in the midst of oppression, it brought a spark of hope, even if small. As I floated in that sea of darkness and wails, I began to notice shapes emerging around me. At first, they were just shapes, indistinct outlines that seemed to be made from their own shadow. But as the figures got closer, they became clearer, and then I recognized them. There, standing before me, were rabbis and teachers who had been pillars in my spiritual formation, men I admired, whose wisdom I absorbed like a disciple hungry for truth. Their faces, however, were distorted, not by years or death, but by an agony that transcended the physical. "Rabbi Isaac?" My voice came out hesitantly, almost like a whisper. The old man who had been my mentor in yeshiva, whose knowledge seemed as vast as the sky itself, looked up at me. His expression was one of despair. "Levi," he spoke my name, and his voice carried a weight I had never heard before. "You are here because you too walked the path we walked, and if you don't listen, you will follow the same fate." Destination. My mind raced, searching for meaning in what was happening. "What do you mean? Why are you here? You were a man of God." He shook his head slowly, and his eyes filled with tears. "Yes, I was, but I was wrong. We were wrong." As he spoke, other figures joined him, familiar faces, rabbis I had met at conferences, teachers who had shaped my faith, and leaders I revered as examples of piety. Everyone shared the same expression of anguish. "We make mistakes because we put the law above the spirit, Levi," continued Isaac. "We have become blind, idolizing traditions and interpretations that satisfied our pride, but ignoring the essence of God's word." I tried to refute it. "But you taught the Torah. You defended the truth." "We defend the shadows, not the light," another voice replied. It was Rabbi Goldstein, whom I had known in my youth. All our feasts, sacrifices, and traditions pointed to something greater, something we refused to see. "Who are you talking about?" My voice shook, but I already knew the answer before I even asked. "Of the Messiah," Isaac replied, his words nearly breaking under the weight of his grief. "The one the scriptures pointed to from the beginning, the one who suffered and died, as Isaiah wrote. We reject him, Levi. We made the Torah our idol, while the purpose of the Torah was right before us." My heart felt like it was tearing apart. Their words echoed truths I had suppressed for years. Isaiah 53, Psalm 22, the stories of Abraham and Moses. Everything I had studied, everything I had taught suddenly seemed to take on new meaning. "But what about me?" I asked, desperate. "Can I still change this? Is there still time?" Isaac looked at me, and his expression softened a little, although the sadness remained. "There is hope for you, Levi. You can still choose, but it is a choice that needs to be made with your entire being. There is no more room for compromise." Before I could respond, the figures began to fade away, like smoke being carried by the wind. Her wails blended into the darkness again, but her words were burned into me like a brand of fire. And then, at that moment, something started to change around me. A light, faint at first, began to shine in the distance. It was small, but it seemed to push away the darkness as it approached. Something was coming, or maybe someone. The light that appeared in the distance was unlike anything I had ever seen. At first it looked like a small, flickering flame, but as it approached it grew in intensity, filling the dark, oppressive space with a glow that drove away even the echoes of tormented voices. It was more than light. It was a living presence, charged with peace, power, and a holiness that I couldn't understand but immediately recognized. I felt paralyzed, not with fear, but with awe. My instinct was to look away, but I couldn't. The light grew even more until I noticed a figure emerging from its center. At first it looked like just a human form, but as it became clearer, I realized it was something infinitely grander. The figure was dressed in something that seemed to be made of light itself. It wasn't a fabric we know, but a kind of cloak that emanated shine and heat. Her face was indescribable, not because it was nondescript, but because it carried a beauty and authority that surpassed the limitations of language. And your eyes, I will never forget those eyes. They were like two wells of infinite love and absolute wisdom, capable of seeing the deepest part of my being. "Levi," he said, and just hearing my name in his voice made my heart tremble. It was a voice filled with power, but also with a tenderness that completely disarmed me. "Who are you?" I managed to ask, though my voice was barely a whisper. The figure took a step forward, and each movement seemed to fill the space with an indescribable peace. He didn't need to answer directly. Inside me, I already knew. He was the Messiah, the suffering servant Isaiah described, the one I had neglected, ignored, and in many cases rejected. I am the one the scriptures point to from the beginning, he said, his voice soft but firm. The sacrificed lamb, the promised king. I have come so that you may see the truth and take it back to the world. I felt an avalanche of emotions hit me. I wanted to prostrate myself, apologize, justify myself, but I also knew there were no justifications. He knew every part of me, my teachings, my doubts, my stubbornness, and yet, the only thing I saw in his eyes was love. But why me? I asked, feeling crushed by my unworthiness. I rejected it. I taught others to do the same. I am not worthy to be here. He came closer, and the light around him enveloped me, warming me in a way I had never experienced. Levi, you studied the Torah, but you saw only the shadows. I am the light that the shadows pointed to. The Torah was not nullified. It was fulfilled in me. Now you can see clearly. That is why you were brought here. Suddenly, entire passages of Scripture began to unfold in my mind. Isaiah 53 made sense in a way I never had before. Psalm 22, with its description of suffering, was not just a vague prophecy. It was a portrait of all that he had been through. Even Genesis 3:15, with the promise that the woman's descendant would crush the serpent's head, now glowed with a meaning I had never seen. He placed his hand on my shoulder, and in that touch I felt a peace so profound that tears began to stream down my face. You must go back, Levi, he said. Share what you saw. Many will resist, but some will listen. And know this, I will be with you every step of the way. Before I could respond, the light around me grew in intensity, filling everything. It was as if the sky itself was pouring down on me. And then, suddenly, everything went dark. When the light completely enveloped me, something extraordinary began to happen. The scriptures I had studied for decades, verses memorized, interpreted, and taught, began to parade before me, as if they were alive. They were no longer just words written on parchment or pages. They were scenes, images, intertwined stories that pulsed with new and vibrant meaning. I was in a space where time didn't seem to exist. It was as if the past, present, and future of the scriptures unfolded simultaneously. A voice echoed in my mind, clear and firm, but full of patience and love. It was the voice of the Messiah. From the beginning, everything pointed to me, he said. Let me show you. The first scene that emerged was from the Garden of Eden. I saw Adam and Eve before the serpent, and the voice resounded, I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your offspring and her offspring. He will bruise your head, and you will bruise his heel. Genesis 3:15 came to life. I saw the promised descendant crushing the power of the serpent. That descendant was him. He was the Messiah. The vision quickly changed to Abraham. I saw him on Mount Moriah, lifting the cleaver to sacrifice his son, Isaac. A voice echoed, God will provide himself the lamb for the burnt offering. But this time, it wasn't just about Isaac being spared. I saw the true lamb, the Messiah, who would become the final sacrifice. My mind exploded with understanding. The Jewish festivals emerged in quick succession. Easter, with the blood of the lamb that saved the Israelites in Egypt. Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, with the high priest entering the Holy of Holies to offer blood on behalf of the people. The Feast of First Fruits, symbolizing resurrection and new life. Each of them was a shadow, a figure that pointed to him. When you read these stories, he continued, but you didn't see the fullness. They were always about me. Then came Isaiah 53, a passage that had troubled my heart for years. I saw the image of the suffering servant, bearing the iniquities of many. He was pierced for our transgressions, was crushed because of our iniquities. These words had been engraved in my memory since my youth. But now, for the first time, I saw the real suffering of the Messiah. I saw his wounds, the weight of the pain he carried, and I realized that this suffering servant was the Messiah himself. Other passages emerged. Psalm 22, which accurately described the crucifixion, Jeremiah 31, with the promise of a new covenant written on hearts, Daniel 7, where the Son of Man received eternal authority, glory, and power. Everything pointed to him. I did not come to abolish the law or the prophets, but to fulfill them, he said. And in that moment, I understood. The Torah, the prophets, the Psalms, these were not simply instructions or stories. They were a great mosaic that revealed the Messiah from the beginning of time. I started to cry. They were not tears of sadness, but of deep regret and indescribable relief. All my life, I had searched for truth in the scriptures, but I was stuck in the shadows. Now the light had revealed the complete picture. But why now? I asked, my voice thick with emotion. Why show me this after all the years of blindness? Because I chose you to testify, he replied, and because time is short. You must return and share this truth. Not all will hear, but some will hear, and those who hear will have life. Your words were like fire in my heart. I knew my life would never be the same again. With every fiber of my being, I felt a new purpose forming. I had found the Messiah, and he had found me. The light around me seemed to pulse with a life of its own, and the Messiah's gaze was fixed on me. There was a calm in his presence, but also a seriousness that hung heavy in the air. I knew something crucial was about to be said, something that would define the rest of my existence. Levi, he began, his voice resounding like soft thunder. I showed you the truth because there is a purpose for your life that has not yet been fulfilled. You must return. To go back. The word echoed in my mind like thunder. Go back to the world, to my old life. Part of me wanted to refuse. I felt such a deep peace there in his presence that the idea of returning seemed painful. But before I could say anything, he continued. You must tell what you saw, he said. Not just for your own, but for those who seek the truth without even knowing it. You will be my witness. My voice shook. But why me? There are others more worthy, wiser. I have rejected this for so long. I have taught otherwise. How can I be his witness? He came closer, and his hand touched my shoulder. The moment he touched me, an indescribable warmth coursed through my being, filling me with strength and confidence that were not mine. I don't choose the perfect ones, Levi. I choose the willing ones. You've known the shadows, but now you know the light. That's what makes you capable. Still, my mind was full of doubts. But, Lord, I insisted, no one will believe me. My community will reject me. My wife, my family, they will abandon me. What can I do alone? The Messiah inclined his head slightly, and his gaze penetrated the deepest part of my being. You won't be alone, he said. My spirit will be with you. It will guide you, strengthen you, and give you words when yours fail. You will face resistance on Levi, and there will be times when you feel like you cannot continue. But remember, I will be with you until the end. His words sounded like an unbreakable promise, but also like a warning. I knew it wouldn't be easy. My mind could already imagine the reactions of the people closest to me, the contempt, the rejection. But at the same time, there was something in his words that stirred courage within me, a courage I didn't know I possessed. He took a step away, and the light around him began to shine even brighter. Levi, he said, this truth is not just for you. It is for everyone. Go back and call those who can still hear. Time is short, and the choices made now have eternal consequences. I wanted to say more, ask more questions, but words failed me. I felt a mixture of love, awe, and a newfound determination. The Messiah did not need to say anything more. His presence was enough to fill me with purpose. I will, I finally managed to say, my voice thick with emotion. I will do as you asked me. He smiled, and the glow around him grew until everything around me was consumed by light. I could feel myself being taken back. The peace and light began to fade, but his words remained engraved in my heart like a fire burning within me. Suddenly everything went dark, and I felt like I was being pulled back into my body. The sound of voices and busy movements began to fill my ears. The world around me came back like an explosion of sounds and sensations. I heard strained voices, as if someone were shouting in the distance, but the words were blurred and muffled. My head felt heavy, and my lungs burned as I sucked in my first breath of life. The sharp pain in my chest brought me back to reality, a pain that I would later discover was coming from the chest compressions the paramedics had performed to revive my heart. He's back, a male voice exclaimed, full of relief and excitement. My vision, initially blurred, began to clear. I could make out faces around me, paramedics panting, their clothes rumpled and their faces covered in sweat. Rachel was there, kneeling next to me, tears streaming down her face. She held my hand as if her very life depended on it. "Levi!" she shouted, her voice cracking with emotion. "Oh, thank God, you're back." I tried to speak, but my throat was dry, and the words wouldn't come out. My body felt fragile, as if every muscle had been drained of strength. All I could do was squeeze Rachel's hand lightly, as a small confirmation that I was there. The paramedics began checking my vitals. 14 minutes and 16 seconds, I heard one of them say. He was technically dead for over 14 minutes. "Miracle," said another, shaking his head. "Simply a miracle." But I knew it wasn't just a miracle, it was a calling, a mission. Everything that had happened during those 14 minutes was clear in my mind, as if it had just occurred. The light, the Messiah, the scriptures that had unfolded before me. It was all so vivid that it seemed more real than the world around me. When I finally managed to speak, my voice was weak but determined. I saw something. Rachel looked at me with wide eyes. "What do you mean? You're confused. Don't talk now. Just rest." But I couldn't wait. It was like a fire was burning inside me, begging to be shared. "Rachel," I said, my voice shaking, "I have seen the Messiah." The silence that followed was deafening. Rachel looked at me as if I had said the most absurd thing she had ever heard. "What?" she finally asked, her voice broken. "What are you saying, Levi? That doesn't make sense." The paramedics, still busy with the latest procedures, exchanged uncomfortable glances. It was clear that they didn't understand, and perhaps didn't even want to understand. But I didn't care. The truth was in me, and I knew I needed to share it, even if no one was ready to listen. Later, at the hospital, I tried to explain to Rachel what had happened. I told him about the darkness, the voices of repentance, the ancient teachers, and finally, the encounter with the Messiah. His hands shook as he listened to me, and his eyes were filled with confusion and fear. "Levi," she said, her voice low, "you must have had a hallucination. This can't be real. You've suffered trauma. That's it." "It wasn't a hallucination," I replied, more firmly than I expected. "I know what I saw. I know who I saw. Rachel. Everything we believed, everything we learned. We were looking into the shadows. Now I saw the light." But she just shook her head, unable to accept it. "You need to rest. Let's talk about this later." The days that followed brought more than just rejection from Rachel. When I shared my experience with synagogue leaders and congregation members, I was met with incredulity, hostility, and even accusations of heresy. "You are blaspheming, Levi," said some. "You are dishonoring your position as rabbi." My standing in the community quickly began to crumble. I was removed from leadership and many of my closest friends cut off contact. But despite the pain of rejection, the truth I had received was greater than anything I could lose. The days that followed my return were marked by isolation and anguish. My home, which had once been a haven of peace, now felt cold and strange. Rachel barely spoke to me. When I tried to explain what had happened again, she would look away or end the conversation abruptly. The silence between us was heavier than any argument. In the synagogue, the situation was even worse. People who had previously respected me as a spiritual leader now looked at me with suspicion. Some confronted me directly. "You're confused, Levi. Don't talk about these things anymore." Others simply ignored me, as if I had ceased to exist. Still, I couldn't deny the truth I had experienced. The scriptures now had a completely new meaning for me. Every time I opened the Torah, I saw the Messiah within its pages. It was impossible to return to the previous state, as if nothing had happened. It was during this period of rejection that I first heard about a small community of Messianic Jews in Manhattan. It was a discreet, almost unknown group, made up of Jews who believed that the promised Messiah had already come. At first, I hesitated. Going to them meant crossing a line that, in the mindset of my community, was unforgivable. But something within me, perhaps the very spirit that the Messiah had spoken of, led me to seek them out. The meeting took place in a simple, unadorned room. When I walked in, I was greeted with warmth and kindness, something I hadn't felt in weeks. They didn't look at me suspiciously or try to correct me. Instead, they listened to me. When I started sharing my experience, I didn't see looks of disapproval or doubt. I saw eyes shining with understanding and emotion. "You're not alone, Levi," said David Stein, the group's leader, with a warm smile. He was a middle-aged man, with a calm voice and wisdom that came through in every word. "What you saw is what many of us have also experienced, in one way or another. The Messiah opened our eyes, just as he opened yours. They introduced me to Brit Chadasha, the New Testament, and for the first time I read about the life, death, and resurrection of the Messiah I had encountered. It was as if everything I had seen and felt during my near-death experience was written there, word for word. As I read, tears ran down my face. How have I never seen this before? I asked David. We grow up with a vision that prevents us from seeing, he replied. But when the Messiah opens our eyes, there is no going back. I spent months learning from them, rediscovering the scriptures in light of what the Messiah had revealed. Each encounter with that group strengthened me to face rejection from my former community and, often, even from my own family. It wasn't easy, but I felt an inner peace that I had never experienced before. Over time, I realized that this small community was a gift. There, I found people who understood my journey and supported me, even when everything around me seemed to fall apart. Together, we shared the same mission, to bring the truth to as many people as possible, even though we knew that many would reject it. As I write these words, my heart is torn between gratitude and urgency. Gratitude that the Messiah found me even in my blindness, revealing truths that I could never have understood on my own. And urgency because I know that many of my brothers and sisters are still living in the shadows, as I have for so long. My near-death experience was not just an extraordinary event. It was a calling. It wasn't a story for me to keep, but a truth for me to share, even knowing the consequences. From the day I came back to life, I faced rejection, isolation, and even ridicule. My wife, Rachel, still struggles to understand what happened to me. My former community sees me as a traitor, someone who abandoned tradition. But none of this diminishes the truth that burns in my heart. To my fellow Jews, I say this: read the scriptures again with an open heart. Re-examine Isaiah 53, Psalm 22, Daniel 7, Genesis 3:15, and all the passages that point to the promised Messiah. Ask yourself why these words so clearly describe the Messiah who has already come. Look at the sacrifices, the feasts, the priesthood. All of this points to something greater, something that has already been fulfilled. I know it may seem impossible to accept this. I know because I myself have struggled with this truth my entire life. I spent years teaching Torah and traditions, believing I was defending the true faith. But deep down, I knew something was missing. And it was only when I faced the darkness and saw the light that I understood what was lost. Perhaps you are reading this with skepticism or even anger. Maybe you think I'm mistaken or deluded. But I implore you to consider, what if the Messiah you wait for has already come? What if his rejection was a mistake that can still be corrected? To those who do not share the Jewish tradition, this message is also for you. The Messiah came not just for one people, but for all humanity. He is the bridge between the Creator and his creation. His words and his actions are the fulfillment of a promise that transcends time and space. He is the answer to the emptiness that many of us carry without even knowing it. My prayer is that you will not ignore this calling. Life is fragile. I know this better than anyone. One moment I was standing, fixing a toaster, and the next moment I was standing before the Messiah. Eternity does not wait for our indecisions. The choices we make now have consequences that go beyond this world. The Messiah is calling you, just as he called me. Are you ready to respond? Are you ready to seek the truth, even if it challenges everything you thought you knew? The choice is yours, and the time is now. I, Levi Solomon, am no longer just a rabbi, a teacher, or a religious leader. I am a witness to the light that transformed my life. My prayer is that you will see it too, before it is too late.